It's historical fact that the Vikings found the Americas nearly 500 years before the Spanish Empire, but in my hometown there's a centuries-old legend that persists. One of Vikings and Native Americans warring on a Massachusetts cape, and possibly the final resting place of a very prominent Norseman. What's up, everyone? Welcome back! So I have an interesting and hopefully entertaining tale to share with you guys today, a maybe unknown or forgotten legend from many centuries past, yet a very intriguing piece of Massachusetts lore. Did Norsemen, aka the Vikings, discover and explore the coastline of New England almost 500 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue? And if these raiders from the north came to the shores of Massachusetts, did they make contact with the natives that resided here? There's an old legend on the northern and more forgotten Cape Ann located in Massachusetts' rugged North Shore. The legend states that not only did Vikings come to Cape Ann around the year 1007, ranging south exploring from their settlements in Greenland and Labrador in the summertime, allegedly according to a historian in the late 1800s, Vikings made contact with natives on the shoreline and it quickly turned into a violent confrontation. As it escalated, there were losses on both sides, and a prominent Viking was supposedly laid to rest in what the Norsemen called the Cape of Crosses. Now, of course, regular viewers of this channel know that I love history, and I many times try to sneak in a little lesson during my videos. This is a little more straightforward, but hopefully it's well received. Who really knows at this point? But let me be very clear, I'm telling this from a standpoint of folklore and legend mixed in with some historical facts just to keep it in context. I am in no way stating that these events did in fact take place or that this story is 100% historically accurate. It's just meant to be an entertaining tale that at the end of the day, hey, it very well may have taken place. It's within the realm of possibility, and I think that's what made it so intriguing to me as a kid when I first heard the tale. I was probably 8 or 9 when I bought a small book called The New England, Viking, and Indian Wars written by Robert Cahill in 1986. I was already obsessed with Native American history, pioneers, explorers, the whole colonial period in general. I probably watched Last of the Mohegans over 1,000 times by the time I was a 10, annoying my brothers and parents, tying up the family VCR for hours upon hours. This book, while telling a new narrative to me anyways, was mostly fiction, but it told a new and exciting story that I never heard before, and it took place partly where I lived. The Native American history on Cape Ann, where I'm from, is very unique and interesting and goes back over 10,000 years. If you're interested in future videos, I can and would love to share some of the things I've learned over the years through my personal research and even bring you to some of the historical and meaningful sites for the local tribes. It seems the only native history that's taught about Massachusetts coastal region is in regards to the Plymouth Plantation, the First Thanksgiving, and Cape Cod area tribes, but there were natives settled throughout the Mass Bay area. On the northern coast in Cape Ann, it was not the Massachusetts tribe, or Wampanoag as they're referred to many times, which I've read wasn't even a tribal name and actually meant a warring band, or as they translated it, band of brothers. Anyhow, the tribe that lived on Cape Ann were an Abenaki-speaking tribe of Pennacook, which ranged from Cape Ann up through the Merrimack River area, the New Hampshire coast, and the far south of Maine, even ranging as far inland as the New Hampshire Lakes region. They were very similar culturally to the Pawtucket, who are also an Abenaki-speaking tribe. The Abenaki Nation belonged to the larger Algonquin native language family, and they ranged all the way up the Maine coast to maritime Canada. Now, this much about what I'm speaking on is historical fact. The Norse, or Vikings as they're referred to, which let me just straighten this out for you guys real quick too. Vikings aren't a people. The word Viking was a verb, an action word. It meant to go raiding, or as the victims referred to them as raiders, or ones who did the raiding. But the people who did it were either Norse from modern-day Norway, Goths and Swedes from modern-day Sweden, or Danes from modern-day Denmark. And they didn't wear horned helmets either. But what is now undeniable historical fact is that the Vikings, or Norse, did 100% discover the Americas almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus allegedly did for the Spanish Empire. Not only did the Norsemen have a settlement on the dreary island of Greenland off of Canada's coast, but around the same time period they had a small settlement for a number of years in Newfoundland, Canada. It's an internationally recognized UNESCO-protected historical site, excuse my French here, Los Os de Meadows, which translates to Meadows Cove on the northernmost tip of the island in the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Labrador being the mainland, Newfoundland being an island. But it's actually historical and archaeological evidence that the Norse had explored at least part of the Canadian coast and even had a semi-permanent settlement there. Not up for debate. Clearly, I know I didn't say that right, the name of the place in Canada. You can make fun of me in the comments as you like. Have your fun. Don't be too mean. The legendary Viking Eric the Red, otherwise known as Eric Thorvaldsson, is the Norseman credited for discovering the settlement in Greenland. Eric the Red, which is most likely named for his bright red hair and beard, following a family tradition of exile started by his father, who was cast away from Norway to Iceland in the 900s. Around the year 982, Eric the Red, 1,000 years before I was born, by the way, was exiled for 3 years from the Icelandic settlement for some kind of infraction and sailed west in exploration. During this time, he is credited with discovering and settling the first permanent settlement on the dismal island of Greenland. The names are deceiving. Iceland is only covered by around a quarter of the island, which is glaciers, while the rest is very beautiful volcanic ruins, beaches, waterfalls, etc. When it was first discovered by the Norse, many believe this is where their gods originated from because of its immense beauty. The island of Greenland, as it was named, is actually mostly a giant frozen wasteland. They settled on the far south coast of the island, survived mostly from whale, seal, and fish. They most likely used the fat from seals and whales for many functions. They began to trade with the local Inuit tribes who had lived the same lifestyle more or less since the last ice age. One of the very valuable goods that the Inuit traded with the Norse was ivory from the tusk of the magical narwhals, which my kid's mother thought I was making up until she Googled them just a few years ago. It's not actually their tusk, it's like their top left front tooth. They're very interesting creatures. I Google them if you don't know what they are. Norse craftsmen would use the beautiful ivory pieces in jewelry and ornaments. They even discovered chess pieces carved out of the precious ivory. They also sold kings the tusks and told them they were unicorn horns. Vikings, beyond raiders and men of war, were tradesmen, merchants, explorers. They were a vital part of the ancient economy, especially during the Middle Ages. By the year 1000, 1100 AD, their influence ran east from the Silk Road in Asia to the Atlantic shores of Canada in the west. Unlike legendary empires like Alexander the Great's Macedonian or Genghis Khan's Mongolian Empire, the Vikings never conquered, settled, and ruled for the most part. Let me say in some instances, but for the most part, they came out of the north like a hell-driven winter storm and made their mark on history. Then they either assimilated into the local cultures or went back to Scandinavia. In Ireland, Scotland, and England, they mostly assimilated with the locals. Norse DNA really doesn't have much of a mark in the UK this many centuries removed, but in Normandy on the north coast of France, Duke Rollo took control of the province from the French emperor in order to protect Paris from further Viking attacks. Normandy is one place in particular where Vikings or Norse all as a group moved into and stayed in one general area and changed its historical trajectory for centuries to come. But back to the New World and Eric the Red. So one of Eric the Red's sons was the legendary Viking explorer known as Leif Erikson. Leif is the man most historians credit as finding the settlement in Newfoundland, Canada in the early 1000s. The settlement was similar to the one in Greenland his father discovered. It maybe lasted for a matter of years to several decades. Both settlements were on borrowed time where their supply chains extended to the far maximum on the western edges of the known world. The winters were too hard to survive and get established through. They didn't have the necessary means to get a strong enough base to set up and make their settlements last. Iceland is basically in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, but it's possible to sail back to the UK or Scandinavia and make it back within a year or two, bringing supplies and new manpower. But the journey from North America back to Europe and back again was unrealistic. Keep this in mind, the Vikings did all this with the most primitive maps, mostly using the sun and stars as navigation. Also, they were sailing in the colossally dangerous North Atlantic Ocean in an open boat called a Viking longship. The Viking longship was a marvel of ancient technology, usually from around 60 to 100 feet long, run by crews of usually 25 to 60 men, and they could hold over 100 people in them. These boats could sail in wind or row in still waters. They were sturdy enough for the open ocean, yet sleek enough to creep up narrow rivers and inlets and over great shallows. It's always been a dream of mine to sail in one of the great replicas they've built of these classic Viking longships, just magnificent feat of navigational engineering in the ancient world. One would have to believe that these early settlers in Greenland and Newfoundland, seeing how difficult the winters were actually going to be to survive, naturally would have felt the urge to explore south down this new wild coast in the summertime, their traditional exploring and raiding season of the Norse. Eric the Red had three other sons that are known besides Leif, and allegedly in this old Cape Ann legend, his son Thorvald may very well have been buried here on this rocky peninsula. Before the late 1800s, I don't believe that this legend even existed. A man by the name of Pringle wrote an extensive history of the city of Gloucester, and he was the first one to mention a Viking and native interaction that possibly ended with the death of a prominent Norseman. Honestly, Pringle was more of a publicist than an historian. He was most likely piggybacking off the success of the History of Gloucester, written a few years earlier by John J. Babson, a direct descendant of the earliest settlers. Pringle most likely added the tale of Vikings in for a little extra flair and to separate himself from Babson's book, which was published a few years earlier. In the early 1900s, there was a spike of interest with Vikings and Norse, with many historians trying to make sense of the ancient sagas. In the ancient Norse Icelandic sagas that go back over 1,000 years, there's a story of one of Eric the Red's sons named Thorvald who died in an exploring mission and was buried in what they called the Cape of Crosses. In the late 1800s, there was a hotel called the Hotel Thorvald on Atlantic Avenue on the back shore in the Bass Rock section of Gloucester. Apparently, Pringle hinted that this was possibly Thorvald's final resting place. Now, let me be perfectly clear, there's over a dozen other locations from Rhode Island up to Canada that claim to be Thorvald's final resting place. And the coastline that the sagas describe could really be anywhere from like the Chesapeake Bay to maritime Canada. Knowing how far they sailed and discovered, nothing is really out of the realm of possibility for the incredible Norse, but the reality is they most likely never came as far south as the coast of Massachusetts, most likely the Canadian maritime provinces and maybe the Gulf of Maine, but honestly, who knows? It's really fun to imagine. It's interesting too because Cape Ann has a very strong Scandinavian population, especially in the 18 and 1900s. Many Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish people moved to Rockport and the Gloucester neighborhoods of Lanesville and Bayview to work in the massive granite quarries. There's still like at least two operating Lutheran churches on the island. Rockport public schools even have Ragnar the Viking as their team's mascot and logos. As a kid, I would get kind of confused after reading that book about the Vikings and Indian Wars, half believing that Vikings had settled here on Cape Ann and never left. So now, knowing all that we know, let's just indulge ourselves for a moment, shall we? Let me do what you guys seem to like, and I'll tell the damn story already. As Thorvald and his crew of hardy Norsemen were exploring the coastline of this beautiful rocky peninsula covered with thick woods that in some places came right to the coastline, there were many great shallows and coves to shelter their boats, and there were many islands close to the shoreline as well. This is the place where many people argue Thorvald discovered Cape Ann 600 years before Samuel de Champlain and John Smith. As they were surveying the coastline, a long beach of sandy white shores, as the Icelandic sagas described it, many people believe this could be around the Wingersheek Beach area, one of the few existing native names for places in Gloucester. Wingersheek is on the western bank of the entrance of the Annisquam River, the only other existing native name for a place in Gloucester. Only that was anglicized from Wanasquam to Annisquam for Queen Anne, which Cape Ann was named after as well. But this was a central location for the natives in the Cape Ann area as well. And it could possibly be the place that Thorvald saw the overturned canoes on the beach. All right, 1 second before I get into the story. Even 100 years after the first settlers lived here, there was a small Indian or native village in the Riverview area of Riverdale and Gloucester, right on the Annisquam River and across from Wingersheek, more or less. This is contrary to what most history books say, but through my own research, I found out that it's a false history that all the natives died within the first generation of European settlers here due to smallpox and other diseases. The true story of how the Europeans basically stole their land and pushed them into ever shrinking areas over a longer period of time is a much less fortunate story to tell. My whole life I've always wished to see what it was like here when the first settlers came, just to experience it for a day. Man, that would be so cool. The native Pennacook tribe that lived on Cape Ann traveled everywhere, especially in the summer months, by dugout birch canoes. These things were amazing. They would slowly make them by burning holes into the birch trunk and then digging out the charcoal, repeating the process until it dug out to the right depth where the canoe would balance on the water. They were fast and the natives could paddle quickly across open water. To travel by foot from Wanasquam to Wingershik would take nearly a day, but by canoe it was only a matter of minutes. So this is what Thorvald allegedly saw, were several of these birch dugout canoes, which from a distance may have looked like rocks or something else, but it caught the Viking's eye. When he and a band of around 20 heavily armored Norsemen carrying swords, shields, battle axes, long daggers, etc. came to the shore to closer investigate, they walked up to these shapes in the sand suspiciously. When finally the Norsemen flipped them over, the birch canoes, a half dozen frightened natives jumped out, yelling, trying to flee. The Vikings quickly cut down 5 of the 6 natives. One ran off into the sand dunes and safely into the forest. In the sagas, they refer to the natives as Skreelings, which I guess are wildlings or something cool like that. I'm pretty sure they used to call the Irish that too, but anyhow. As Thorvald and the Norse surveyed the beach for more Skreelings and cleaned up the area, possibly saying a prayer for the slain natives, at this point almost all the Vikings had converted to Christianity and left their old pagan Norse gods behind. But at some point, Thorvald decided it might be a good idea to leave the area. This skirmish had gone in the Norse's favor, but who knew how many Skreelings lived on this cape? As Thorvald and his crew of hardy Norsemen made their way back to their Viking longship, birch dugout canoes engulfed the Norsemen from all angles. Although there were probably multiple settlements across the Cape during this time period, the main native settlement was located on Riverview, which is basically just one giant clamshell heap at this point. Yes, the native Cape Ann tribesmen were clam diggers too. How cool is that? But it's geographically right across the river, so probably within an hour or two, all the adult males of warring age could have been assembled and ready to attack. Who knows, the number could have been well into the hundreds, but it was most likely at least double the size of the Viking crew. They quickly swarmed the Norsemen with slurries of arrow shot and then disappeared back into the many inlets that dotted the Ansquam River marshes as the Vikings manned their oars and fled the scene. As the Norse began to make a retreat from the newly discovered land, Thorvald, captain of the ship, brother to the legendary Leif Erikson, and son to the explorer Eric the Red, was fatally hit with a native's arrow. As the Norsemen solemnly set sail back to the north, their captain, Thorvald, brave son of Eric the Red, asked to be buried at what he called the Cape of Crosses. It was his dying wish, and his obedient crew granted his demand. Thorvald was a baptized Christian and wanted a proper Christian burial. My belief is that the Cape of Crosses is most likely somewhere much farther north, closer to the settlement in Newfoundland, somewhere that Thorvald would most likely be more familiar with and had some sort of sentimental value to him. I don't believe it was on a different part of the same cape that the conflict took place in. I would think that the Norse would want to get away from that place, and with haste, not knowing how many natives truly lived in the area, for all they knew it could be in the thousands. But still, the legend persists that not only did Vikings explore and discover Cape Ann before the French and English, but Thorvald and his crew battled these fierce Skraelings, and the mighty Viking hero is buried somewhere here in Gloucester, Massachusetts. What do you guys think, huh? So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully it was informative, entertaining. Hopefully somebody will actually watch it. Whatever, man. I'm just kind of doing it just to keep myself busy and have something for you guys. And yes, in about a week or so, we're going to have another on the road video. I'm not going to tell you guys where we're going, but it's a real big one. It's one I wanted to do since the very beginning. It's going to be pretty awesome. You don't want to miss it. So before that, though, guys, just remember, make good decisions, make good choices. I don't mean to harp on it every single video, but it just keeps being reminded to me in the world every single day how important our decisions and our choices are. So make good decisions, make good choices. Take good care of yourselves, your family, your friends, your fellow human beings. Try to have a nice day, guys. I'll talk to you real soon. We'll be back in a new video. Have a great day. God bless.